Well, this morning we will be discussing the death of Jesus. The death of Jesus is recorded in all four gospel accounts. So if you're taking notes, I'll go ahead and give you all the account references. We will attempt to use all the references equally or as much as possible. You're going to notice that the four references are Matthew chapter 27, verses 50 through 56, Mark chapter 15, verses 37 through 41, Luke chapter 23, verses 44 through 49, and John 19, verses 30 through 37. So yet again, all four of the Gospels record the death narrative of Jesus. You'll also notice that each of these accounts are about 6, 7, 8 verses long. So it's not an extensive text that we're going to be covering. And actually, the three synoptic Gospels, does anyone know when I say the word synoptic what that means? It's okay if you don't. That's why I asked. The parallel views. The synoptics are called Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's the oddball. And you'll notice even John is the oddball in this account. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record a relatively similar set of ideas. I'm going to classify them into four categories. The four categories being: one, Jesus yielded the Spirit. Second, the temple curtain was torn in two. Third, there was a centurion who made the great confession. And fourth, there were women, lots of women. Jesus had a whole little following, and that's kind of the running trend in the three synoptic Gospels. John's a little different. John only records, as far as the narrative to similarity, only records the yielding of the Spirit. After John records the yielding of the Spirit, he then shifts to this conversation of the piercing of Jesus' side. And he spends from, this is John 19, from verses 31 to 37, discussing the piercing. You don't need to turn there at this moment, but he spends that time period discussing the piercing of Jesus' side, going into great detail. We'll come to that here in a moment. However, so as we're looking at these four gospel accounts, I'm going to attempt to look at least three of the similarities: the yielding Spirit, the temple curtain, and the centurion. And then I want us to jump over to John's account and look at the piercing of the side of Jesus. Okay? If we run out of time, we run out of time, but I think we'll be fine. Yet again, in all four accounts actually, the yielding of the Spirit is listed. It's listed in verse 50 of Matthew, 37 of Mark. Actually, it comes down now in about verse 46 of Luke's account, and then it's in verse 30 of John's account. You'll notice that Jesus in these accounts gives that, and I'm going to try and merge some of these accounts together. He gives a loud voice and he cries out, "It is finished," according to John. The others just seem to say that he cried out. But he says, "It is finished," in a loud voice, which would have been strange for a man who was dying by crucifixion. Crucifixion account, he would have been held up in a way that his lungs would not have been able to breathe well. If he's near the point of death, his lungs are probably filled with a lot of fluid, which would make crying out either extremely difficult or unusually impossible. Jesus, however, in this moment, we'll talk about that momentarily, is able to yell out, "It is finished." Which brings us to the idea that Jesus wasn't really dying at this moment, which kind of lends us this idea of the yielding of the Spirit. Is it possible, becomes the question, that men could actually create the death of Jesus? Or was it only possible that Jesus could die by yielding of his Spirit? So Jesus had no sin enter into him. Man could do their worst, but yet the scriptures seem to paint the idea that only Jesus could surrender his Spirit. And by surrendering his Spirit, making the death a more, I'm going to call it meaningful moment. If man could kill him, well, we're able to kill him about anything. But if Jesus willingly gave it up, it becomes a more meaningful time for, thank you. So he's crying out, "It is finished." I I think showing what he intends for everyone to see, that the decisive work that God has called him to do is done. This is not a cry like, oh, I'm dying, kind of a cry. That's not what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is not telling the people on the ground, you have done your work. What Jesus is saying is, I have completed the work that the Father has sent for me to do. Again, this is not a defeat. It is simply an announcement of what Jesus knows is happening. We look at I'm going to use John 17, verse 4 as a text to kind of, I guess, solidify some of my thoughts here. John records in John 17 and verse 4, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them not only to the end, but to the full extent mandated by his mission, is what I'm going to qualify that in, or qualify that with. Jesus loved the people that he was dying for to the fullest extent that God had called him to serve and to suffer for them. So with that, Jesus bows his head. And I'm going to say that in that moment, he's handing over his spirit. No one took his life from him. It wasn't that the Roman guards were really that good, which they were good. You'll notice, and further kind of clarify the thought, we could go and say that the beatings of Jesus were very severe. The nail-scarred head, the hands, and the thorn-scarred head were very severe. However, it was still a shock that Jesus was dead after only a few hours. The other two criminals, I guess I shouldn't say the other two criminals, the two criminals had their legs broken to help speed up their demise. Jesus did not. It's interesting that he died much quicker, lending us yet again to the idea that he willingly gave up his spirit. John chapter 10, verses 17 and 18. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. So Jesus knew very clearly in John chapter 10, verse 17, that the ability to sacrifice himself, to lay it down, and to take it back up again was within his grasp, was within his power. Verse 18, no one takes it from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down. I have the authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. So yet again, coming back to this idea, the first point that I want to focus in on, the yielding of his spirit. Jesus freely gave his life for us. As much as we may want to point to the pains of the cross, as real they were, for us to belittle the reality that he willingly surrendered himself would rob him of the power that God has given him. This reminds me, or at least I think that sometimes maybe our struggle is that we sometimes feel this world has too much to offer. And so we hold so closely to the things that exist here and now. Jesus, on the other hand, looks in this moment and says, this world does not have what it holds for me. My Father has what's really important. Any comments on the yielding of the Spirit? Or questions?
When you said that Jesus said it is finished, there's a powerful sermon right there within itself. That Greek word for it is finished is Palestine, which was a Greek word that was written on the bottom of a debt, stating that the debt had been paid in full.
That word is more than just I'm done. It carries a greater weight to that. Did I write anything down with that? I came across something that was similar to what you shared, Roger, and thank you for that. I just kept writing down more like it's accomplished. But the meaning of that word is far deeper. And I appreciate the debt reference there. Thank you. Any others?
Reminded of the passage where Jesus talks about not many would give up their life. I think that's right.
John, it's got to be probably John 15 area.
Yeah. So that really Mixed up the significance of the cross and not untold. It was out on purpose for us.
Paul had a similar statement when he said, I finished my course, finished. Paid up for me a crown of righteousness, not for me only, but all those that love and superior. And that's what comes to my mind more than any other scripture about death. There's a lot of them, I'm sure. David lay with his fathers, was buried with his fathers. Many patriarchs were said they lay with the fathers. And we go back to heaven, go back to the naked as a Christian.
Gary.
With that in mind, the thoughts you're talking about now, with the purpose of him crying out that loud voice, my God, why have forsaken me? Would that be basically to show that the pain, how real the pain was? Or is there another purpose in that?
I'm going to venture that there's probably another purpose. Offhand, I don't fully know what that purpose would be. I think that you could very, very well say that the purpose of my God, why have you forsaken me, is because the pain is severe. And I don't want to belittle the pain. Even in the it is finished, there is great pain. However, I think that phrase could probably encompass the transference of sin onto Jesus. I think that phrase could cover probably some other things that I didn't really study and thought for tonight or for today. So
we've heard the term all our lives. To every end, there's a beginning, to every death, there's a so that's what Mike said. The significance of death, sacrifice for sin, you beginning conquering of sin and death. It's really significant.
let's, yes, Glenda.
Intellectually, we all know this, whatever you're talking about, all the different aspects of the crucifixion and what Jesus did for us. But how do you get it from in your head to in your heart, where you feel it, where you really feel it? How do you make that transition?
I would say that for me, on the study of this lesson, this thought hit me more, or I guess it hit me more on this study because I spent the time thinking about it. It's one thing to think about the death of Jesus, and it's one thing, as you said, to intellectualize. It's kind of like I got to thinking at some point over sacrifice. You know, we talk about the word sacrifice, and for us, it's like, oh yeah, well, a cow died or a lamb died or whatever. But have I ever held the knife to the throat of the animal and pulled? Well, no, I have not. The most I've done is I've killed a deer from 30 or 40 yards away. That's very easy to do. It's far easier to pull a trigger when you're not associated right there with it. But what's it like to actually pull the knife across the throat, catch the blood? It becomes more graphic. Well, that was the imagery of sin for the Old Testament. The best I could say, and the best from even church history stance, is people spent time praying prayers. There's actually a prayer, there's like several prayers, 5 or 6 of them that I came across that were written by old theologians, saints from the Catholic Church that are all focused on basically Jesus's crucifixion, Jesus's death. I think part of that is we have to put that as a thought of our mind. And in their case, they prayed it. They said, God, and the prayers were all beautiful. They were very credit worthy to God. But to think about it, because very quickly, and we tend to be the type that look for the resurrection, rightfully so. But I think you have to think about it, and it has to be part of our daily life. more than just I go to church, I study my 15 minutes in the morning and move on. I think it has to be part of who we are, our identity. That'd be my advice. Does that answer the question somewhat? Somewhat. Moving on to the second point that I want us to cover here, we come to, and this is yet again in the three synoptic, this point forward is in the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The temple curtain is torn in two. Now, mind you, this temple curtain is no small item. This temple curtain would have been used to separate the Holy of Holies from the less holy places. And this, if you're going off of the Holy of Holies was initially described as 30 by 30 cubits. It seems that at some point it was rebuilt to 40 by 40 cubits, or that the measurements were changed. Either way, this temple curtain is estimated to be roughly 60 feet tall. To give you an example, the peak of this building is probably around 30 feet or so, give or take, maybe a little taller than that. But you're really dealing at about 30 feet from this. So if you're talking 60 feet, if that's the measurement that we're kind of dealing with, that gives you a perspective of how big this curtain is as far as height. It was made out of some beautiful kind of purpley fabrics. It would have been woven with, I think it was purple, blue, and I forget the other color offhand. It would have had cherubim etched into it, and it would have been absolutely stunning. It probably, in a finished product, would have been about 4 inches thick or so. So this one is a thick, big curtain. You think about that item for a moment. It separates the holies of holies. And what resided in the Holy of Holies? Or better yet, who should have? It was the presence of God. The priest, and it was the presence of God. The priests only went into the Holy of Holies how many times a year? One time a year, the Day of Atonement. And that was the day they took off everything that they had that was rich and beautiful. They put on peasant clothes, and they walked in to put the blood of the atoning sacrifice on the mercy seat. This process was only done on those days. And even before, whenever, let's say, the days of the tabernacle, the Spirit of God would leave the Holy of Holies so that they could disassemble it and move it. And they would use this temple curtain to seem to cover up things that they needed to cover to keep hidden. This veil, this curtain, signifies the separation of God and man. Isaiah chapter 59, verses 1 and 2. And only the high priest was permitted to go in. So when this temple, or when this curtain was torn in two, what did that symbolize? Well, I'm going to say that probably in a couple of ways. It first symbolized the fact that the sacrifice, the shedding of Jesus' blood, was a sufficient sacrifice for our sins. In order for God to dwell among man and for man to dwell among God, there seemed to be the need for ritual purity. Well, if the high priest could only enter once a year after the atoning sacrifice, and if you entered wrong, what happened to the high priest? Wasn't long before he fell over dead. Matter of fact, there's this running tradition. They would start tying a rope around the leg of the priest, because if you went in and you died, well, how do you get the body back?
Wasn't there a bell also for the bottom of the rope?
Oh, I don't remember that
I
part.
thought I read maybe in the Old Testament there's a bell we come on.
They'd tie a rope at least, and if he didn't come out, they could at least drag the body back. So I think that first this symbolizes that the atoning work of Christ was complete. It signifies that the Holy of Holies was open for all people, that people could in some way go in and now dwell in the presence of God, both Jew and Gentile. Acts chapter 17, verse 24 defines this a little bit further. The God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in a temple made with human hands. So at this moment, the presence of God residing exclusively in a temple has shifted. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 8 through 9. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened, as long as the first section, the temple curtain and those things around it, are still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper. But you go on go back to Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 13, and the Hebrew author says, in speaking of the new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. The Hebrew author spends a great deal talking about in chapters 8 and 9, the temple curtain and the ability to move through this now because of the sacrifice of Christ. In some ways, Hebrews would also say that the veil was symbolic of Jesus himself as the only way to the Father. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19. We have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, that being the new veil, a new and living way opened up for us through the curtain, that is his body. Here we see the image of Jesus, flesh being torn, just as the veil was being torn as well. He grants us the ability to walk into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of God. And Hebrews would also tell us in Hebrews chapter 4 that the veil in the temple was a constant reminder of sin that resided within us. Since then, this is Hebrews 4, verse 14. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who's unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who is in every respect has been tempted as we are, but yet was without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, other words known kind of as a mercy seat, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need. I think the first thing we have to realize in the tearing of that curtain was it symbolized no longer a separation between God and man. It allowed man the access to God. But something else that I think we would probably need to say as well is that that veil being torn meant that God was no longer confined to a box. He was then free to leave as well. Israel has this idea of holiness that starts in the center and moves outward. The Holy of Holies was the holiest place on planet Earth, and wherever the Ark of the Covenant sat was truly holy. You built a tent around it, and that tent became holy. And then you build a little bit further out, and that became holy. But you notice even in the development of the temple, the further away from the Holy of Holies you got, what began to happen? The less holy things were. That's why only the high priest was allowed in. That's why there was a court of priests, there was a court of men, there was a court of women, there was a court of Gentiles. And then outside the court of the Gentiles were the heathens. The further away you were from the center, the less holy you were. If the curtain was now torn in two, there is no longer a center. The presence of God now goes out everywhere. Zechariah prophesied this in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 20 and 21. On that day, there shall be inscribed on the bells of horses, holy to the Lord. The pots in the house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar, and every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them, and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. And there shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. Zechariah is prophesying about a time when the presence of God, the holiness that he creates, radiates beyond just a box that existed in Jerusalem and goes to a world. Any thoughts or questions on the temple curtain being torn in two?
I'm reminded of the presence of God when Moses went up on the mountain. Nobody's seen God live physically, but he had a radiance. He came down with a radiance to see God.
Put a veil over your face.
Levi's same way. They didn't really see God, but he was present to communicate with him and offer sacrifice to him. And he's a spirit. Those that worship with worship spirit and truth. And The truth is, God is so powerful and so radiant, we just can't comprehend it. And the power of God is shown through his Spirit, always and always, has been and always will be. He showed it through the Old Testament many times with miracles. The donkey that spoke, miracles in the New Testament. So the radiance of God is powerful. It can perform miracles when he chooses to. And God chooses to do it at the appropriate time. And there was a miracle to rent a 4-inch curtain. And so God's in charge.
And the beauty that exists there when God's in charge, the miracles of his presence, and then to know that that presence is no longer isolated to one location, but it then shares to all the spirits. Thankful that we can carry the Spirit of God. Thank you for that, Bruce. Other comments or thoughts?
Michelle had an interesting thought. She said, I wonder if they fixed the curtain. And where we went back and repaired it. We tried to keep putting God back in the box. And, they obviously didn't do anything. Gentiles wrote them with it.
That's a great question. Did they fix the curtain? You know, we don't know. I'm going to say yes. Because what was it, 70 AD when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple?
Well, my thought process with that was with Jesus' death, what the Jewish traditions were, that changed. Some things changed. And I just wondered if, did they go back to the old way? Or did they recognize the significance of that and change it forever?
Greg, are you unmuted? Is that Greg?
Yes.
Go for it, Greg.
There's a passage in Hebrews, I think it runs something like this, that there's a new and living way to God through the veil of his flesh. I don't exactly know the reference, probably somewhere around chapter 10.
Let's see, did I just quote it? It's chapter 10, verse 19.
Yeah. So looking at the veil of his flesh as being the body that was torn, kind of has an interesting tie with the temple veil being ripped apart.
Yeah. Awful interesting coincidence. I'm going to put that in quotes if I can. Coincidence. That those were both happening at the same time. By the way, it's no coincidence. I did that quotes for a reason. Glinda.
This is off the wall, but
I'm sitting down. I'm ready.
sacrifices. The Jews were required to offer animal sacrifices on a regular basis, correct?
Correct.
And there were only certain people, certain priests that could accept sacrifice. So you think about what, 600,000 people came out of Egypt. How did the priests manage all those sacrifices that those thousands of people had to do? How was that accomplished? You have a line clear of nation. Oh, to be killed.
There was a constant flow of blood.
I'm trying to remember. There's a document that talks, it's somewhere, it's about the day that Solomon dedicated the temple, and the number of oxen that were killed and the number of animals that were killed. And it is mind-boggling to think about the animals that were killed for sin. As Roger said, there was a constant flow of blood from the temple. And here's the thing that we don't talk about. Yet again, in our conversation, we're talking about, for us, a sacrifice is, well, it's a sacrifice. But for those of you who've ever gutted an animal before, does it smell pleasant? No, it does not smell pleasant. Well, if you got thousands of animals around that are all being gutted together, what's the smell? And you think of the flies, and you think about all the other stuff that goes along with that. Well, that all existed then. It was not a clean process. And you're right, you start counting up the amount of animals or the amount of meat that was created in these things, it was massive. And the thing is that Hebrews would tell us that all of those sacrifices really could not solve the problem. I'm out of time. I'll give you a Reader's Digest of the Centurion Believes, because I have an interesting thought on the centurion that I want to share, and that will be the centurion by church tradition. His name is Longinus. So if you want to go look him up, it's long in us. But that's church tradition. We really don't know the guy's name. We don't really know much about him, except there's a lot of tradition and history and things that people say. A centurion was a man who led about 100 men. And in my opinion, he would have been very used to a crucifixion. This would have probably been his full-time day job. That's what he did. The reality that he can look at Jesus and can say, there's something different about this guy, speaks to the way that even Jesus died. The thing that I find that I came across that I want to say is maybe most interesting is it possible that this Longinus character was the first true Christian? And let me tell you why I'm posing that question. At the cross, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. The disciples went for 7 days and hid. You had John, who was at the foot of the cross, but the disciples hid for 7 days and still were questioning what was really happening. This man stood at the foot of the cross and said, this guy's legit. So is it possible, just throwing that for you to think on, for you to chew on, that this was truly the first Christian? And by the way, he's not a Jew. He was a Gentile. Okay. I have this line that I got this was from a commentary. If God can tear the veil in the temple, he could rend a Roman soldier's understanding of a dying Christ. That is, if God can split open Jewish sacred places, then a Roman centurion's heart and mind can be opened by God's word. I'll leave that with you. Thank you very much for your attention and your contributions. We'll look forward to studies next week. Thank you.